Hi, this is Peter Kelly-Detwiler. I'm a storyteller and author talking about global decarbonization and the energy transition. And today on our show, we're going to talk about how you create an adaptive organization in the face of a climate-constrained world and a changing climate. We're also going to talk about how you talk about climate with an audience, half of whom doesn't even believe the story you're telling them. And then we're going to dig into some of the lies and truths about batteries, electric vehicles, the power grid, and recycling. So we hope you'll come and join us for what should be a very interesting conversation.
Welcome back to part 2 of our delicious conversation with Peter Kelly-Detwiler. Peter is a former senior vice president of a leading Constellation energy demand response team. He has an abiding obsession, which is to understand whether or not humanity will collectively rise to the challenges of climate change. He spends about 3 hours a day pursuing all the information he can possibly get around the technology, the politics, and the economics of the global energy transition. And in part 1 of the show, we talked about exactly that. We talked about how he ended up in that world, sort of indirectly, and really looking at what all this energy transition means for you as an organization, as a company, as a leader, and what we've really got to look at. And one of the things that Peter very keenly pointed out was whatever information you've got, no matter how right you appear to be in this moment, if you don't stay on top of all the given information of what's coming at you, like I said, the guy spends 3 hours a day studying this research. You're always dealing with old information. You know, you've heard me talk about before. You go to college, you get a degree, a 4-year degree, and if in most subjects, everything you learned in the first 3 years are pretty irrelevant, and most of what you learned in the fourth year of your degree has some relevance in time, but you don't really care too much. So because information's changing so quick, and a lot of the time it's filtering that information that's the more important thing. It's not just getting it. We live in an age where, content is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's the filtering of the content into the context of knowing what's relevant that matters most. And that's what this guy does every single day. So we're going to dive deeper into this conversation and get a little bit more understanding of where it is all at. We talked about before, we were talking about this change, and I really want to bring it back to something that is a specialized area for you, Peter, which is certainly even in the context of the U.S. The U.S. grid, you and I talked in a previous conversation about how it's an old system, particularly in major cities like New York and Chicago, that there's a specific kind of steel needed for it. A lot of the grids are falling apart. Then you've got independent grids like Dallas, not Dallas, but Texas, with its problems. And we saw what happened when they had an extreme winter or they have an extreme summer, which again is potentially climate change and what that means. And so we're all looking to do these big electric things, and we're plugging them into a system that seems to be falling apart. We know, for instance, in the U.S., the U.S. runs on about 20% clean energy. That's only 20%. There's the 80% that's running on fossil fuels and natural gas, et cetera, et cetera. So we got that problem. Then we've got electric cars and the batteries, and we've got cobalt being mined by children. I know that that's changing. You and I talked about that, and you definitely put me on the right path with all that. And all that is creating these unintended consequences. You are masterful at looking and showing others what these unintended consequences are. So I know I just laid out a big thing, which is the grid, plugging in with all the power and using electric vehicles and the electric stuff that is now battery driven, including my screwdriver or whatever it might be. And all those things need materials that are coming from places that are not, quote, first world. And you're a man who traveled and spent a long time in Africa. So you have a bit of a sort of feet on the ground experience. Can you kind of pull that together? I know I just gave you a lot to pull together. Can you
That's okay.
Pull that together?
Yeah, because that is what I do. All right. So
I don't think I told that to anybody else.
All right. So we start again with the decarbonization challenge. How do we, between now and 2050, limit the emissions so that we stay at 1.5 degrees or maybe 2 degrees centigrade? All right. So how do we do that? So there are a couple major sectors in the economy. Transportation, major one, right?
Yeah.
Industry, another major one. And then electricity, the third one.
Mm-hmm.
And the first piece of this is you do this thing called, quote, electrify everything, beneficial electrification. You take the electron and you push hydrocarbons out of other spaces. So, for example, you could take oil and gas heating and cooling, but mostly heating, and use ground source heat pumps or air source heat pumps, which are way more efficient because for every kilowatt hour of electricity, for example, you get about 3 kilowatt hours of free heating and cooling from the ground, from that ambient 55 degrees. So you do stuff like that. You electrify transportation. And if you get your typical vehicle and you jump into an internal combustion engine in the wintertime and it's cold and there's frost on the windshield, what do? You
turn it on, you turn on the heater, and you use the waste as heating your car.
Exactly. And the whole rest of the year, that waste is useless. It is indeed fully waste. And when you're driving in stop and go traffic, you're generating that waste. It is a very inefficient way to move around. So now you supplant that with electricity and a battery that has about a 90% round trip efficiency. You lose about 10% on the round trip. And when you're not moving, the only electricity you're using is for heating and cooling the cabin and the radio, right? And even in the worst grid, like 90% coal-dependent West Virginia, you're still cleaner from a carbon perspective with an EV. Now, you do have a carbon debt because for the first year and a half or so, the battery was probably made in China with coal. And so therefore, there's an embodied carbon in that. But then the savings over time pay off that debt, and then you're essentially carbon-free. So if we are going to decarbonize the world and we're going to use electricity to do that and also use electricity to generate hydrogen, which could then clean up the steel industry, and you could take green hydrogen from renewables and put it into the fertilizer industry, agrichem, and also some of the petroleum refining. Now you're talking about supersizing the grid, potentially 2 or 3 times what it is today. And yes, we have a grid that's creaky today. We've seen some of the stresses it's under. We're also seeing, when they had that heat wave in the Northwest a couple of years ago, they had 115 degrees Fahrenheit. They were not expecting that for another 20 or more years. Yeah. So you now have a situation where a lot of these grids are facing more environmental stresses. At the same time, we're asking them to get bigger. At the same time, there's NIMBY and Banana build absolutely nothing anywhere, anytime, push back against that. So they're almost facts that are mutually incompatible. And we've got to figure out how to thread our needle through those. But yeah, big picture, we are asking the grid to do a lot. One thing, there's 20% renewables. There's also another 20% nukes. So we're about 40% carbon free right now. And about 12 years ago, we were only at 10% renewables, and that was all hydro. So in the last 12 years or so, we've grown the renewable fleet here quite considerably. Solar, for example, was 1,000 megawatt installed in 2009, and now it's 100,000 megawatts, and about 25% of that is on the customer side of the meter on rooftop. So we have seen remarkable change, faster than anybody thought possible, and we're going to have to do it even faster.
So let's go to this, because you talked about, there's a carbon debt even with electric vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the pushback. Now, you got these electric cars, but, there's a carbon debt, they're made in China, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And then we've got, then 10 years, your battery's done, and it can't be recycled. No, but I'm saying that's the argument.
I know.
It can't be recycled. So you've got, you said that's wrong. Has that always been wrong with the batteries?
The batteries were generally not recycled when we were back in the day of our iPhones and everything else. Now there's so much scale because your average car, like that Ford F-150, the little one, is 98 kilowatt hours. That's almost 4 days. It's 3.5 days of consumption on an average house. Okay, so now batteries are so big that it makes sense to build an industry to recycle them and take out the valuable lithium, the valuable cobalt, the manganese, the nickel, everything else. So you have companies like Redwood Materials that's now raised over $2 million. They just, to build, and they just did an acquisition in Europe for Europe's leading recycling company, just announced today. So you're now seeing billions of dollars of capital moving into that space because it's clear this is going to be a massive economic opportunity. Korea's POSCO is building a gigafactory, and all the raw material is coming in from recycled vehicles. And there was $300 million given out by the US DOE that was announced. I saw the article today, and at least two of the companies, they're not recycling, Dove. They are taking the used EV batteries, and when an EV is considered the battery fully depreciated, it still has 80% of its life left on it. So taking all those used batteries after the 150,000 miles when the warranty's done, that battery still has 80%. There's a lot of Teslas out there with over 200,000 miles with still 90% of charge left on the battery.
Wow.
Yes. So now those batteries, before you rip them apart and extract all the materials, yes, some are the cylindrical shape, some are prismatic, some are pouches, but still, you can, using artificial intelligence, and GM, for example, they monitor all the batteries in the Ultium pack through the vehicle life. So they know, even before the car is done, what the cell life is. So now you have all these companies that are saying, before we even do anything with these, let's have them be these zombies that can still walk around, the dawn of the dead sort of thing, and provide services to the stationary power grid, potentially for decades, depending upon how hard and how frequently we cycle them. So there's... And
just make sure I understand that, Peter, because I may have this completely wrong.
Yeah.
So this EV vehicle, the battery is done.
Yep. For the car. Yep.
Yeah, is for the car.
Yeah.
But it's still got 80 to 90% of its actual power.
Yes.
Instead of recycling, taking it and using whatever power's in there and adding that to the grid.
Yeah, you repackage it. You take those cells out, could look just like a little AA, sort of thing, and you repackage them and test them and put them back into the grid. And in fact, Underwriter Laboratory already has a certification for it because they know they can't get insured unless it's certified. And so, yeah, there are already companies figuring out second life applications all over the place.
So that's an interesting thing. That I love the idea that this second life application versus the recycling, which people tend to not trust, generally speaking. And certainly many things were not particularly recyclable before, but now reusing them or reapplying them is a vastly different idea, because it's not, what's left is not necessarily working for the vehicle, but has a much better application somewhere else, which is back into the grid where we're using energy.
Some will go into the grid and some will not. But if we take the analogy, so recycling, you got plastics 1 through 7, and some are really complex and they're all dirty and all that. I think the analogy that's more helpful here is lead acid battery. Every time you go and pick up a lead acid battery, you drop off the one you had in the car, all that stuff, almost all of it gets recycled. And now with recycling chemistries and batteries, they use a hydrometallurgical recycling capability versus the pyrometallurgical was heat-driven before. Now you can get 95+% of all your materials out of the black mass, the shredded materials from the batteries. And so it's really becoming cost-effective to do that. And so, so the company Redwood Materials, they're building their factory right next to Tesla, to the Gigafactory, because it's going to be the mine mouth, if you will. And they already have the first contracts to sell the copper foil from the first small quantities of batteries. One of the challenges, Dov, is the batteries aren't wearing out as fast as people thought that they were. So recycling companies are having to wait a little bit longer for the material.
Right.
Good news for everyone else and bad news for them.
Yeah, they're a little ahead of their time. But again, let's talk about, for a minute, not too long, but let's talk about this idea of not necessarily battery recycling, but just recycling. This is where people get so frustrated with this whole idea of carbons and protecting the planet and recycling, and so much comes out about how much bullshit is around recycling, how your stuff is not really getting recycled. I just saw a short documentary about Vancouver and the recycling plant in my city, the city I live in, where they burn shit. They're not recycling at all. And they've got a license for this recycling, and they're just collecting stuff and burning it. And we also know that a lot of, was it 70+% of the stuff that's recycled never gets recycled. And meanwhile, I'm standing in my garbage rooms, taking the bottles and taking the plastics and taking the papers and doing all that. And every now and then I'm like, yeah, what's the point? I still do it.
Yeah.
But it's frustrating.
Yeah. And it's a recipe.
Your research, tell me about that.
Okay. So there's a recipe for cynicism. Once China said they weren't going to take the recycled plastics, it basically put a bollocks in the whole thing, right?
Exactly.
I don't even know if that's the right word for it or phrase, but it messed it up. Now, that having been said, like PET, the number one's the PET, and number two, the less complicated, they're much more easy to recycle. But one of the things that I think about is as you develop a circular economy, first thing you got to do is design with the disassembly in mind, right?
Yeah.
So you should use less complex plastics whenever you can. And then in energy, one of the reasons renewables have become so prevalent is because states said, if you want to sell electricity as a utility in the state, next year, you're 15% renewable. The year after that, you're 16. The year after that, you're 17, and so on, or you lose your license to operate. Nobody so far is saying to the plastics users, you want to play this game and sell shampoo? 10% post-consumer content, 11 the next year, 12 the next year, 13. If you don't drive the market, it ain't going to happen. If you just rely on, and this is the thing, the plastics manufacturers, they deliberately deceive the public. You see the ads on TV. I'm not making this up. You can find it well documented. They know full well the challenge that you just expressed. Yep. And I was talking to someone because I'm working on the next book outline, and one piece of it is recycling. And I was talking to someone here who said, if you go to the local MSW, Municipal Solid Waste, you'll find they intermingle all the recycling and then separate it again. So yes, it gets separated, but you wasted all your time. Now, some green shoots and opportunity for, hope. There are some markets and they're growing. And I'll give you one example. There's a place I read about in northern Michigan that they sort their waste and they pay less tipping fee if they recycle. Well, they live near Mackinac Island. And Mackinac is famous for fudge, and Christopher Reeve was, movie up there in the hotel. And what do they need? Summer workers. So they lose all the summer workers. So they actually have to take people out of the penal system and put them on the separating line. And they also use disabled adults to do this. And the guy who ran the facility said, 20% of my time is figuring out labor. Well, they just got a robot that uses artificial intelligence and optical capabilities, and it can do 100 pics a minute, and it's getting better. So, and now this thing is being used, these technologies are being used in multiple places. So, we talked about the march of technology and the things you think you know. AI is going to change a lot of things, some in really ways that are horrendous that we don't like.
Yeah.
Like manipulating information and that sort of thing. And other things like this, creating efficiencies we can only dream of today. So, but I think you've got to start by politically having the bravery to say, right now, this is an externality. We're asking consumers to pay for this. This problem was created by industry. It needs to be solved by industry. They have to be part of it. Now, aluminum cans, way better. Why? Because an aluminum can is so valuable. It is embodied electricity in that can. To recycle a can takes 5% of the original electricity to make the can. So aluminum is really valuable. Plastic is not. So, there are some ways, though, at the end of the day, government's job is to do a couple things. It's to protect us from, enemies, but one of the enemies or threats we're facing now is a degraded environment.
Yes.
That's, in my view, the government's job is to protect us from threats, both human and otherwise. If they change the rules of the sandbox and make it cost-effective for entities to perform in certain ways or punitive for them not to, they're, like I said before, companies are amoral actors in pursuit of profit. They will do whatever gets them there. Government has to set the rules of the sandbox.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And at the same time, it's very clear that, there's this, it's profitable. We know that the research is there to be green. But at the same time, that also means there's been a lot of greenwashing with Volkswagen and the diesel engine, which was absolute bullshit. And even IKEA got busted for, I think it was Russian old forest they were using as opposed to, and so the greenwashing thing is, again, it puts people to not trust. Then we get this, the other side of it is I don't trust it, therefore I don't trust where the information is coming from. And now there's this sense of, if we're going to become net zero or whatever the term might be, well, we're not going to be able to fly, and we're going to have our freedom shortened, and we've got these 15-minute cities, which is going to make, and this all. I mean, one can call it conspiracy, and I understand that, but I also understand that people are part of the emotional source code of America, of the United States. The key word in our emotional source code as Americans is freedom. Anything that feels like a threat to freedom, you are going to get a massive pushback on. How do we get through that almost paranoia? Because it has some background in some truth.
Without question. And certainly people don't like being told what to do and how to do it and so on. There are other freedoms. There are freedoms for lower income people in cities to breathe the quality of air that you and I enjoy routinely that is being infringed upon every single day. There are freedoms of future generations to live in a less degraded environment that we completely disrespect. We'll take all our freedoms all day long and throw our externalities over the fence and let some other generation deal with that, and their freedoms be damned, right? So if we want to talk freedoms, let's talk about this holistically and not just about mine and yours, but about everybody's freedom and how that all fits in together. Otherwise, we're basically having a very infantile, uninformed, selfish conversation. Now, there's ways of packaging that and getting people to eat the food they don't want to eat, the same way you fool a baby into, here comes the airplane with a spoon, right? You can talk to people and do that sort of thing.
I'm just imagining these executives and you're spoon feeding them being net zero or whatever it might be.
We kind of do that all the time, but
here it comes.
Well, because some people, you have to figure out what people are capable of achieving. And sometimes for me, that means disrespecting their intellect and saying, look, I would have an honest conversation with you, but I honestly don't think you're capable of having an honest conversation. So let me package this in a way that may be deceptive from my perspective and maybe even dishonest. But if it's the only way I can get you to do the right thing, then maybe I'll package it a different way. Is that respectful? Absolutely not. But is it sometimes necessary? Probably. I don't know. It's a very uncomfortable place to be because I just like saying, look, here's the freaking problem. Let's figure out as intelligent, passionate, loving human beings how to solve this. It's not that hard. But once you run into the hard rocks of ideology, your ship can founder everywhere, and we know that. So then, yes, it is about changing that story and figuring out narratives that work. Always have.
You talk a lot about this, the big picture, and a lot of the argument around the big picture is, okay, well, the two largest populations in the world are India and China.
Yeah.
And sure, U.S. does better or Europe does better at cleaning up its stuff, but that doesn't change the fact that China and India are still going to be cranking out stuff and poisoning the planet, even if you look at it at that level. How do we deal with that? I want to get to the positives.
I think it's a great question. Okay, so the first thing is not that, well, how about them? Because first of all, China has half the per capita emissions of the United States and almost none of the carbon debt that we've accumulated. So 1.2 degrees that's up there right now, we own the lion's share of that, right? So you can't just say, oh, we're starting now from a neutral playing field. We've had the last 100 years to industrialize. China doesn't get it, right? Can't do that. And then the second part of it is we've offshored a lot of our dirty industry to China. So basically, what we're doing is we're just playing a game of thimbles. We moved the P over here and said, it's your P, not ours, right? So in that sense, everything we import, we become somewhat, a lot responsible for that. But But, Dub, a lot of this comes down to our awareness. And that's a hard issue. So let's take one example, which is a little field, but it's not. You order 2 pairs of shoes from a company because you don't know whether a 12 and a half or a 13, to use my feet, is going to be the right size based upon whether it's a Adidas or a Pumas. If you went into a shoe store and tried both of those on, the one you tried on that didn't fit would go back up on the shelf in stock and someone else would buy it. You do that same thing and order them both online, you get the shipping cost, the Amazon comes to your house or Zappos or whatever. A lot of those companies, once you put that shoe on, it does not go back into the economic ecosystem. It often goes into the trash or will go to Goodwill or something. People buy 5 dresses for a wedding, right? They should know what happens to the other 4 dresses. I'm not trying to make people feel guilty. I'm trying to make them aware, and then they can make the choices they want to. But decisions born from ignorance are not informed decisions. Let's start with the information.
One of the things that I've talked about in my work is, outside of the addiction to identity, which we all have to deal with ourselves and with everybody else, but is, I often say to people, why do people buy from Amazon? I get it in the beginning, it was cheaper, but it's not anymore. Amazon's not cheaper, and oftentimes it's more expensive. So why do you buy from Amazon? And the answer is because you have an addiction to convenience. If I rename Amazon as 7-Eleven, that's what it is. It's a convenience store.
Yeah.
And there's a cost to that convenience.
Absolutely.
That human beings pretty much are not willing to give up, right? So it's convenient. When electric cars are convenient, people buy them. When they're inconvenient, they don't. When if you go, well, I'm not going to have an electric car because it's inconvenient for me to go from A to B because I don't know where to plug it in. And then you go, oh, well, there's all these places you can plug it in. It's like, oh, yeah, I'll have an electric car.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yep.
I don't have an electric car. I love electric cars. I like them a lot. I don't have one because my building doesn't have the adapter yet.
Yep.
So when my building doesn't have the adapter, I can't do it. Right?
Right.
Inconvenient unless I'm going to get up in the middle of the night and drive somewhere and plug it in. Yep. So that's a driving force for human beings because we are pretty freaking lazy. And as you're talking about, in the economies of scale, things become more convenient. So let's sort of switch the gear there and say, you do so much research, you've done it for so long, and you've watched these changes. What are key reasons for hope, including technology and economic development, as we're moving forward with this dark cloud of climate that is often turned into a nightmare, which it may or may not be?
Yeah, well, the insurance companies won't stop insuring things from an economic perspective. It's starting to become, just from that level. But okay, room for hope.
Yeah.
When I first was looking at, trying to grab 30 megawatts of panels from GE, they wanted to sell them to me. It was $3 a watt installed. Those same panels today cost roughly, in Europe, 20 cents a watt, and here 30. And batteries, like solar panels have fallen in cost by, I think if you look way back to 2008, like 97%. Wind turbines have gotten a lot cheaper. Batteries have gotten a lot cheaper. And why is that? Because there's 2 things conspiring at the same time, 2 major things. One is economies of scale and production ruthlessly drive down all the supply chain efficiencies out of the process and the manufacturing efficiency. The second, these are inherently new technologies. And so there's a migration path for the next at least 6 or 7 years, and I write about it in my book, for how solar panels are going to get 0.5% more efficient every single year. And with batteries, there's so much work being done on salt water-based batteries that have no cobalt in them and, all different, because it's new. Now, you bring in material science, and fundamentally, many of these problems we're trying to solve boil down to chemistry and physics, right?
Yes.
Especially on the grid. It's how are we moving stuff? How do we generate power? How do we move it? And how do we consume it? And that's all physics and chemistry. Now, You take an incandescent light bulb, which was pushing a current through a filament that didn't want it, made out of tungsten, and the filament said, unglowed because it got so hot. It's why you can't unscrew a 60-watt incandescent light bulb, because you're generating, it's a heater masquerading as a light source.
Yeah.
Now we have LED lights that are, 10 times more efficient. We have supercomputers like, I went to go see at Lawrence Berkeley Labs, Ori. This was a supercomputer that could do 14 quadrillion calculations per second and burned about 3.5 megawatts to do it. And she could be trained to go into the periodic table and solve for X. You want a better battery chemistry that does X? Corey, solve for this. She'd go into the periodic table. After we'd come back with 200 theoretical compounds that never existed before in the history of the world. You want a glass on a solar panel so smooth that that soot would slide off it like snow on a cold windshield, or, that sort of thing, go do it. So then you get those theoretical compounds. I was telling a physicist on a plane one day how cool this was, and he looked at me like a dope. Sometimes it happens. And he said, yeah, but now you got to synthesize it. Well, luckily, I had just had a conversation with somebody a week before in a lab, and I could look at the physicist like a dope and say, yeah, but you don't know about robots, do you? Robots can synthesize 24/7, and they don't feel shame. And so therefore they record failures and successes. And now you can start to triangulate, and then you bring a generative AI and you can actually comb through the failure data and approximate. So the speed with which we are making better stuff on the grid in particular is accelerating. I loved Corey, and unfortunately I got infatuated with her, which is too bad, because I researched her the other day about something, and guess what? She's gone. May 2023, gone. Replaced by Perlmutter. 64 quadrillion calculations per second, so 4+ times as fast, and only 2.5 megawatts of energy versus the 3 that Corey used. And Perlmutter, the new one, is specifically designed for material science inquisition. So those are the sort of things that make you realize, yeah, every time we open the toolbox, of course the tools are going to get better and shinier, because there are literally hundreds of thousands. There's 40,000 scientists just in Contemporary Amperex Technology, the largest battery company in the world out of China that makes 34% of the world's batteries. 40,000 with advanced, it's 1,000 there on a 40-acre campus with degrees in material science. There are literally tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of scientists solving these problems. Perovskite in solar, better wind turbines. There's so much money in this space that now all the research institutions are focusing on this, 6 ways from Sunday. That gives me hope. The money is flowing into this space way faster than it ever has before. We're starting to see $1 trillion plus a year investments. Now, between now and 2050, we have to get to about $100 trillion in order to solve the problem. The feds have, for the first time ever, since World War II, we have an industrial policy in this country focused at really driving change, and it's already stimulated about 100 new investments in manufacturing facilities at a cost of $80 billion so far of leveraged additional private investment in this country. So a lot of movement is afoot. The question is, how fast? How does this race work on a go-forward basis? But the one thing I can guarantee you, and it's why I'm so addicted to it, is every time you look at the chessboard, you're like, it's three-dimensional, and someone just put 2 new pieces on the board I don't recognize.
So it's from that point of view, does it feel to you like there's no way in the world you could know what the space will look like even in 2030, which is really around the corner?
I think 2030 we kind of know, because you look at things like modular nuclear and other tech and go, this is the earliest they can get there because of permitting and other things like that. But when someone says, there's no way we can solve this by 2050, I look and I say, there's more innovation that's going to happen in the next, say, 27 years than has probably taken place in the history of humanity.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what's fascinating to me, because, you get to be a certain age bracket, and I look at how much impossible is now every day.
Yeah.
The computing to go take a man to the moon is less than the computing in my iPhone.
Yep.
Like that alone is like, if you need a reference point, like my granddaughter who is 2.5 has her own iPhone. Of course it's not connected to the net, but she has her own iPhone. She's 2.5 and she can use with both of her thumbs and pick her own games and play games and all the rest of it. And that iPhone, which I think is a 5 or 6, is still equal to what it took to get the man to the moon.
Yeah.
And she's playing little games on it. It's like,
she's a cyber physical being and doesn't know it.
Exactly. Augmented humanity. We talk a lot about that and think of these cyborgs. Like we're all augmented. You're wearing glasses. Those are an augmentation.
Yeah.
And every one of our walking computers called a cell phone is an augmentation.
Yes.
I'm not going to be sticking any probes in my head at any point that I can plan. But we're moving at such a fast speed that we don't even notice it. I think it's so fast we don't notice it.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you ever read Alvin Toffler's Future Shock?
Oh, yeah.
And he talks about the half-life of information. I mean, my half-life of information is probably less than, I don't know, a month or two. I was at a conference last week, and so I haven't read for the last 3 days more than maybe 3 or 4 hours, and I feel desperately out of touch with what happened last week.
It's like this whole AI thing, right? Everybody's on top of it, and I'm like, you're really stabbing in the dark here, because even if you think you're on top of it, even if if you spend 3 to 4 hours a day on researching the AI and what's happening to it, you're still so far behind. And the rest of us are not even spending 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah.
So, I really appreciate, I'll tell you what I appreciate, Peter, not only your commitment and dedication to do the work and understand it, but your commitment and dedication to re-examine what you know, because it gets you out of that bias that's so easy for any expert to fall into and say, this is what I know so far, and it could be shit wrong in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And it might also be gospel in 10 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that can move so fast. And I really appreciate that about you, Peter. So thank you.
Well, it's maybe because I don't want to be wrong in the long run, but I had an argument last week with someone at dinner. I said, here's my thesis. And I laid it all out. I said, now, prove me wrong and send me the information and destroy it. Have at it. This should be a constant, ongoing Hegelian dialectic. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? And it's not just in my head. That should be going on socially everywhere all the time for our greatest chance of success at living together harmoniously as a species.
Yeah, and you talked about these ill-considered consequences, and I think the greatest ill-considered consequence is of being fixed-minded about something.
Mm-hmm.
The consequences of that are dramatic and dangerous, and that if we don't open up to listening to the other side, I want to listen to conspiracy theorists. Not because they're right or because they're wrong, but because they have something that I've never considered.
Mm-hmm.
And so let me consider that. And even if I do end up coming to it's absolute horseshit, that's fine.
Yes.
Right? But I got to get my bias out of the way. One of my great teachers many years ago said, please go away and study something you don't understand. Study something that doesn't agree with you. Study something that you think is absolutely wrong. And then come back and tell me how you were wrong. And then I was like, ooh, I don't like that idea. And it was in my 20s, and I went away and did that, and it taught me how to operate in the world. It taught me to live in a place of this thing, the curiosity in everything, because I might be wrong, and if I am, I'll grow, and I can hear and understand other people. Because even if you're dead wrong, you have a reason for believing it.
Well, that gets back to the culture you talked about, right? Good leaders embrace discomfort, and they get their teams to embrace discomfort and, be comfortable with the pace of change and, that sort of lack of clarity.
Peter, this has been a truly fascinating conversation. We're once again at the end of, this is now part 2 of our conversation. I sincerely thank you for the work that you're doing in the world and for joining us on the show today. I would love it if you would tell people where they can find out more about you. Obviously, we can see, if you're watching this over your shoulder, theenergyswitch.com. But there are other ways to reach you and find out about your book. Please tell us where those are.
Sure. So I do have a website, peterkelly.detwiler.com without the hyphen, but the easiest way to find me is LinkedIn. I mean, I don't even have a business card anymore. Everybody moves that all the time. So once I find the LinkedIn thing, that's where they are. So reach out to me, please, on LinkedIn. And if you want my newsletter, it's now 35, the list that I read. Happy to send it to you. And I do a weekly video with the top 5 to 10 energy stories from around the world. I think move the needle. That's free. I can also set you up with that. I'll do the work so you don't have to.
Fabulous. Again, thank you so much, Peter, for being with us, for all that you are doing. And, I want to remind everybody that we really need to look at this whatever your position is, just look at it from a consequential place. I heard Mitt Romney saying recently, he's a Republican, and there are a lot of people on the Republican front who don't believe in climate change and all of it. And okay, fine. But as Mitt Romney said, the Republican Party needs to change and do something about climate change. And he was asked, do you believe that it's humanly driven? And he said, I hope so, because how else will we do anything about it? And I was like, that's a smart response.
Yes, it is.
Whether you agree with Romney or not, if we are responsible, we can do something about it. If we're not, we need to do what we can do that is our responsibility. So it's an interesting thought for all of us. Peter, thank you so much for being with us. And for you, dear listener, remember, those who control the meaning, and maybe that's around this very thing, energy, those who control the meaning for the tribe also control the movement of that tribe. And business and political leaders committed to positively shaping those climates know that we've got to type into what drives human behavior. And you can do that by tapping into and understanding the anatomy of meaning that's extracted through the emotional source code of your own, of yourself, of your organization, to build behavioral profiling. And I, Dov Baron, I'm here to show you and your business and your teams how you can harness the emotional source code to move your tribe, because unified actualized meaning is the single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness for individuals and companies. I want to thank you for sharing this show with everybody you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friend. Stay curious about the shifting tides of energy, how you're tied into them, and what you can do about them in a very conscious way. No matter what side of the aisle you find yourself on, you do breathe the same air as the people on the other side. I'm Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the deepest meaning to reach your next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.